Everyone. It's such a privilege to be with you here this Saturday morning. I'm Maine's 50th Secretary of State and first female Secretary of State. My grandmother is 101 years old. She was born in 1920, which was the year, of course, that women gained the right to vote. And so it's profoundly meaningful for me to be in this position, although I hope someday we'll see the last of the firsts, right? Um, so I grew up in Hancock, Maine. I grew up without electricity or running water until I was in the fifth grade. We were poor, but I gained from my parents an extraordinary commitment to social justice. My mother, I remember her running for planning board to save a bald eagle's nest back in the 80s when bald eagles were rare. My father, in addition to being the Boy Scout troop leader and on the fire department, helped start Hancock's first recycling center. So I watched my parents' engagement in our communities and their work ethic and realized that there are things that matter so much more than how much money you have or where you come from or who you are. I feel really fortunate because with strong networks of support and a great public education, and I have been able, when I was taking driver ed and at Ellsworth High School, driving at the time a beat up Chevy Nova from the 70s, I never thought that my name might someday be on the driver licenses. But I've really had every opportunity. And I think that inspires in me a desire to really fulfill the ideal of a democracy that is for and of and by the people, and to think through how we create and fulfill those ideals of opportunity for everyone. When I was a kid, I had a copy of the Bill of Rights and the preamble to the Constitution on my bedroom wall. Now, as Secretary of State, when I walk into my office, I have a copy of the original Maine Constitution and the transmittal documents. And so that is such a thrill. But when you read those documents closely, not the Bill of Rights, but the Constitution, of course, embedded in those documents is white supremacy, is sexism, is oppression. And so it is our job to seek that more perfect union, to think about how we realize those ideals. So before I go into policy and opportunities that I see now in the time that we're in and the work to be done, I'd like to just share a little bit about what the Secretary of State does. Under the Constitution, my role is guardian of the Maine Seal and of all of the historical records and documents of the state. And so a ceremonial but important piece of my role is endorsing official documents, including the transmission of the election results for now Senator Craig Hickman to the governor and to the legislature with the seal of the state of Maine, making those acts official. But it's also as head of Maine State Archives, and I just appointed Maine's first female state archivist, Kate McBrien, who's a statewide expert on some of Maine's hardest history, Malaga Island, the island with a multiracial community that the Maine state government, where we forcibly evicted those residents and confined many of them to Pineland. She's extraordinary. And to be honest, the former Secretary Matt found her first, but she wasn't confirmed during the pandemic, and I was pleased to bring her forward. But as Secretary, and in partnership with the state archivist, we oversee 56,000 boxes of Maine's historical records. Now, I know that because Maine's Cultural Building had a huge HVAC failure and asbestos and mold, and we've had to evacuate that building and move those boxes out. But in those boxes contains our records from the transmission from King Charles to Sir Ferdinando Gorges of the Land Charter of the state of Maine, to Revolutionary War documents, to Civil War documents, to hidden history and difficult history, documents that document our relationships with Maine's Wabanaki tribes. So that's a piece of this work. And I think a really important piece of the work is lifting up hidden history and hard history and partnering with traditionally marginalized communities, with the Wabanaki tribes, to ensure that we are taking a closer look at our history and using that to inform our goals for the future. The second role of the Secretary of State that Penny touched on is head of Maine's Bureau of Motor Vehicles. And that's every aspect from licensing to vehicle registration to titles to commercial trucking. And embedded in that work, of course, is systemic racism in terms of who has access to a driver license or a state ID card and who does not. Who gets pulled over for registration violations or motor vehicle violations and who does not? Who has a license suspended because they cannot afford to pay fines at the court or because they fail to appear because documents are lost? So that's an extraordinary opportunity and an important role. Over 300 of my employees work at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, working with Mainers every day. And then the third piece is a piece that is extraordinarily important to me, dating back to my earliest work at the American Civil Liberties Union. And that is to head the Bureau of Corporations, Elections, and Commissions. And the corporations is important to the functioning of our economy. Every corporation, nonprofit or for-profit, must register with the state, and we house those documents, those annual reports. Elections, however, is fundamental to everything that we care about. When I first went to work for the National ACLU as a field organizer, one of my early projects there at the national level was working with our network of 50 affiliates to prepare for reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. And in delving into the history of systemic discrimination and oppression of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, I learned so much in that national work. And so now coming home to Maine, then when I actually headed the ACLU of Maine, we'd like to think of Maine as a state sometimes that is where things are working well, where we have this pride in Dirigo, right? We lead, but we also have a history of prohibiting Indigenous people from the right to vote, for example. And in my work at the ACLU of Maine, I remember vividly 2010 when a Republican-controlled legislature repealed same-day voter registration. I co-chaired the campaign of allies to restore that. But they tried to strip people who were incarcerated or formerly incarcerated of the right to vote. They tried to strip college students of the right to vote. And perennially, we see voter ID bills and other bills designed to suppress and oppress the vote. We've been really fortunate here in Maine. We have together collectively fought back against those oppressive measures, and we have been successful. Maine is actually consistently top 3 in the country for voter participation. In November of 2020, we were number 3, following Minnesota and Colorado. Minnesota was actually number 1. We had over 75% of eligible Mainers participated and cast their vote in the November election. And that's in part because of same-day voter registration, because failure to be registered does not preclude or stop people from casting their vote on election day. It's in part because we have no excuse absentee voting, and people in Maine can vote up to 30 days prior to the election via absentee ballot. These measures, it's in part because in Maine, every US citizen, including people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, has the right to vote. But we can do better. Why not 80%? Why not 90%? And again, we can do better through modernization and through vigilance to think about those improvements. So I was really excited to read your legislative agenda. I think, for example, online voter registration is a major priority. Yesterday, I spoke to my alma mater, to Ellsworth High School. Earlier in the week, I spoke to Maranacook High School and Bates College. Why can't you register to vote on your phone or online as you can in so many states? Because in Maine right now, you still have to fill out a paper card. But for the next generation, that is something that that creates a barrier potentially. I'm really excited about Speaker Ryan Fecto's ongoing absentee voting bill. In Maine, we have this process of having to fill out an application to then cast that absentee ballot every year. And sometimes that can be a barrier to vote, especially for our seniors, for people with permanent disabilities. And so Speaker Fecto's bill would allow people to fill out a single application for ongoing absentee ballot status and then have Maine issue that application out to those folks every election cycle so that there would be no confusion, no delays, no danger that they would miss the cutoff for casting that absentee ballot. Because of course in Maine we have a 3 business day cutoff. You have to have applied for or received your absentee ballot. You have to apply for it, by the Thursday before the election. So those are some of the reforms at the state level I'm excited to see. I had an extraordinary opportunity. One of the amazing things about being Secretary of State is there's a National Association of Secretaries of State. It's a very collegial environment. And I think 2020 drew Secretaries of State all across the country closer together and in fighting actively back against voter suppression, misinformation, and disinformation. And so we had a conference earlier this winter where we spoke with members of Congress about what I think is the most important. Well, the COVID relief bill is hugely important. I'm so thrilled that it was signed into law because people are suffering right now. But HR 1 and SR 1 are fundamental to everything else that we care about because they're setting a federal floor for voting rights. It is placing limitations on the state because of the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, even measures in HR 1 that conflict with state constitutions. For example, there's a measure I'm really excited about in HR 1 that conflicts with Maine's constitution, and that is to allow early voting, which would pave the way in Maine for people to just go to the town office and cast their vote directly, inserted into the tabulating machine, just as if they were casting their ballot on election day. And it would allow us to mail ballots directly to the public without that step of the application process, just like Colorado does actually. Anyway, HR 1 sets a federal floor. It provides for voting rights for formerly incarcerated persons. It provides for national same-day voter registration. It provides for voting 15 days prior to the election. It provides for drop boxes, just like we implemented in Maine in 2020, in every area with 20,000 county with 20,000 or more residents. It's an extraordinary package that I think is crucial to fighting back. You know, we like to say, and it's really important, that famous quote, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And you think about the good fortune that we have in Maine and the good structures that allow for 75% of people to turn out and cast their ballot. But when you look at what's happening across the country, even right next door in New Hampshire, where a barrage of voter suppression measures is moving forward through state legislatures, this becomes a matter of urgency. This becomes especially for inclusion and equity. So I ran for Secretary of State with 2 big goals. One was technology modernization, thinking about that idea, that promise of a government for and by the people. And how do we strengthen and restore people's connection to our government? How do we leverage technology to help people connect to the services that they need? So that's something I'm really excited to carry forward at every aspect of the Secretary of State's office. For example, this week, we launched an online catalog for our archival collection so people could see what's in those 56,000 boxes, or at least be aware of what's there. But the second goal is equity and inclusion. Because make no mistake, white supremacy does pervade our structures of government in Maine. We do not have representation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we have so much more work to do in terms of representation of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people in structures of government, and making our agencies more welcoming, inclusive to everyone, to people with disabilities, to seniors, to traditionally marginalized and vulnerable communities. So, for example, yesterday we launched a national award out of my office, the Congressman John Lewis Award, to recognize youth leadership in civil rights and voting rights. We are moving forward at the BMV with workplace training on serving the transgender community. We are hiring an immigration expert to work with our staff to train them on how to make sure that immigrant and refugee communities are accessing licenses. And I've appointed 2 deputies, Maine's first Latina Deputy Secretary of State and Maine's first Deputy for Operations, Equity, and Inclusion. So I'm going to stop there and just say I'm really excited about the work that you are doing. I have seen firsthand how individuals and activists and advocates can shape what happens in Augusta and in Washington. And I think we are in a crucial moment for our democracy. January 6th demonstrated the fragility of our democracy. Each one of us has an obligation to do the hard work to move through the challenges, sometimes the pain of confronting the hard truths that are in the society before us, and being a voice for justice and for advancing our democracy for the people. Thank you.